Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Oh, we can do better than that. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Buenas noches. Good evening. I would say it in other languages, but I will have to study. Good evening and welcome to the New School. My name is Michelle DePass, and I'm the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. I would like to extend a special welcome to those that are joining us live stream, and I encourage our online audience to participate in tonight's discussion by submitting your questions in the chat window on your screen. There is a chat window on the screen, right? Okay, good. To our audience in the room, thank you all for braving the cold and the slush in order to be here at the New School tonight, as we continue the Public Policy in Action Lecture Series. I invite everyone to participate in our ongoing conversation on social media by using the hashtag #PolicyForJustice. I repeat, hashtag #PolicyForJustice. Almost a century ago, forward-thinking educators founded the New School to defy the intellectual constraints of traditional college education. Today, the mission of the university aims to prepare students to understand, contribute to, and succeed in a rapidly changing society, and thus make the world a better and more just place. The New School strives to foster creativity, innovation, and a desire to challenge the status quo, both in what and how we teach, and in the intellectual ambitions of the New School itself. The university uses social engagement to orient students' academic experience to help them become critically engaged citizens dedicated to solving problems and contributing to the public good. The Milano School, my school, is proud to be taking an active role in achieving these goals by engaging with some of the most distinguished leaders in public policy, advocacy, and academia of our age. The 2015 Henry Lecture Series, Public Policy in Action, is devoted to advancing social equity in America. This series examines how public policy serves as a vehicle to advance economic and social inclusion in the context of evolving demographic, economic, and political shifts in America. This series serves as a catalyst for the continuing dialogue on the state of social justice in America. The series will explore topics including framing the civil rights for the 21st century, changing demographics and the economic imperative, race, higher education, and social justice, measuring and influencing public opinion, and the new civil rights agenda. Tonight, I am proud to introduce our three speakers, Dr. Manuel Pastor, Rick McGahey, Professor Mick McGahey, and lecturer Juliet Ellis. Let's start with our most fascinating and honorable Professor Manuel Pastor, who came from California to be with us. Manuel Pastor is a professor of sociology and American Studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Dr. Pastor is also founding director of the Center for Justice, Tolerance, and Community at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And he currently directs the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, both at the University of Southern California. He holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Dr. Pastor's research has generally focused on the issues of the economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities, and the social movements seeking to change those realities. His most recent book is Just Growth, Inclusion and Prosperity in America's Metropolitan Regions, a volume that brings together quantitative and qualitative analysis to argue that growth and equity can and should be linked, offering a new path for the US economy seeking to recover from economic crisis and distributional distress. We're very happy to have Manuel here with us tonight. And I will tell you that over the course of the years I've worked with Dr. Pastor, his passion is using data to change hearts and minds, political minds, and to empower communities. So we're very honored to have him here tonight for his lecture. Rick McGahey is a professor of professional practice here at Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy, and the director of the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management Master's Program. He holds a PhD in economics from the New School. Rick is a nationally recognized expert on economic development, retirement policy, program evaluation, and workforce development, who's worked in philanthropy, the private sector, and government at all levels, federal, state, and local. Juliet Ellis is the Assistant General Manager for External Affairs at San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, a department of the City and County of San Francisco that provides water, wastewater, and municipal power services to San Francisco and supplies water to 1.6 million additional customers within 3 Bay Area counties. And we're very lucky to have Juliet here with us at Milano this semester as a lecturer. So Juliet will be taking us through a stimulating discussion at the end of Dr. Pastor's lecture on the opportunities for equity inclusion with Professor McGahey, who will be a discussant. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Manuel Pastor.
So I want to thank Michelle for that kind introduction, and it's always amazing when your friends reach these high places, you know. She did make me scatter rose petals as she walked along, though, now, since she is a dean, so very exciting. Really glad to be with you tonight. Not as glad about the weather that you have here compared to California, but willing to slog through it. And I was asked tonight to talk a little bit about the changing demography of the United States. I was asked to speak about the relationship of that to economic inequality. I was asked to contemplate what policies might address economic inequality effectively and what sort of politics and social movements need to be put in place to make those things happen. As if that was not enough, I was also asked to address whether or not Iran and the United States will negotiate a deal around the nuclearization of Iran, and whether or not Bibi Netanyahu's visit will help or hurt. I was then asked to address whether or not John Boehner will be able to hang on to his job after last week's debacle, or whether he'll become the star of a reality show called Out of Control. And finally, this was Juliet asking me on the way in, if I would contemplate whether or not Hollywood, which after all is located in Los Angeles, would finally discover Latinos and make a film about them. Or, like with McFarlane, crowd them all. Anybody seen that McFarlane USA? Kevin Costner and a bunch of Mexicans, all crowded into one film, right? So we're hoping for change there as well. It's a lot to address in a short keynote, or what we in Spanish call a quinotito. So what I am going to do is talk a little bit about this demographic change. So, and a little bit about the economic inequality. As I always like to say before I start speaking, that while I'm speaking, my voice might break a little bit. It's not that I'm emotional being with you, although what could be more emotional than being at the New School? It's that I have a speech disorder, the sort that Diane Rehm on NPR has, where her voice breaks. It's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around your voice box, and it gets treated once a month with Botox, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So pretty much works for us. So for some of you, the happiest day of the year is your birthday or Hanukkah or Christmas or the end of Ramadan when you can finally eat. For someone like me, the happiest day of the year is the day the census releases its statistics. And when the census released its statistics after the 2010 census, we saw a striking thing, that the growth rate for Latinos in that last decade was 43%, that the growth rate for Asian Pacific Islanders was 43%, that the growth rate for African Americans 11% and the growth rate for non-Hispanic whites 1%. Very different rates of demographic change. And so while many mainstream news commentators were surprised when, for example, President Obama won re-election in 2012 with only 39% of the white vote, anyone who'd been following the demography was not surprised about the change and how it was going to filter in to the kind of growth in the voting public that would take place. Now, what's interesting about this change is that when most people see it, they tend to think that the growth rate in Latinos, the growth rate in Asians, is driven mostly by what? Immigration. And that answer is wrong. Because immigration into the country has been slowing down for the last 4 to 5 years. Amazing little demographic tidbit for you, because amazing demographic facts are wonderful for cocktail parties. You'll be the hit of a cocktail party with demographic facts. Amazing demographic fact, net migration from Mexico, our largest sending country, for the last 3 years has been 0. There's as many Mexicans going back to Mexico as coming to the United States. In fact, that's probably part of the reason why we had the crisis of unaccompanied minor children from Central America last summer, coyotes, human traffickers on the border, drumming up traffic because there's less demand from Mexico. Now, why has that changed so dramatically? Some of it is better economic performance in Mexico and certainly in Latin America and Asia. Some of it is worse economic performance in the United States, but the fundamental driver is the changed fertility rates. 40 years ago, over the course of her lifetime, a Mexican woman would have more than 5 children. Now, the fertility rate in Mexico is 2.3. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. As those two come together, there's less push factors, and as you'll see in a few minutes, what's really driving this growth is growth in children to those immigrants. So what it means, though, is that the United States is projected by the year just after 2040, probably 2043, 2044, to become a so-called majority-minority nation. That is, a nation in which the majority are people of color. That's a striking fact. But there are some facts before then that are even more striking, which is that 10 years before that, around the year 2031, 2032, the majority of the workforce will be people of color. Now pay attention, I didn't say majority of entrants into the workforce, that happens earlier. The majority of the workforce by the year 2031, 2032, people of color, supporting an older, white, retired group. And the majority of youth will be people of color by about 2019, 2020. And again, what's driving that change is the change in the youth population. So this shows you the change in the youth population between 2000 and 2010. The number of young whites actually fell by 4.3 million. Now, I always like to reassure audiences that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News and blamed on the president, right? I mean, you know that. I'm sure that would have happened, and I would make fun of MSNBC too, but I'm in New York, so no one cares. So the reason is that there's more whites moving into 19 and 20 than moving into 0 and 1 and 2. That is, less coming into the youth population, folks graduating out. The number of young African Americans in that decade fell by about 250,000. Some of that is young African Americans redesignating as multiracial, although a little bit less of that's happened than most people think. The number of young Latinos went up by 4.8 million. The number of Asian Pacific Islanders by 800,000. The number of those identifying as multiracial or other also by about 800, 900,000. So that's the next America, and it's being driven by this change in the youth population. Now, interestingly, we have seen this before. If you look at the growth in the United States between 2000 and 2050, in which the U.S. will go from being about 69% non-Hispanic white to about 50% non-Hispanic white. That is basically the change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. California's demographic change, and California's widening inequality as well, was America fast forward. That 20-year period in California's history is essentially what the United States is going through over a 50-year period. And those were a bumpy period in terms of race relations in California. 1992 civil unrest, all sorts of conflicts around policing, the 1994 struggle around Proposition 187, the anti-immigrant legislation, and, of course, the banning of affirmative action. At the end of that process, and there is an end, we've sort of reached this kind of an equilibrium. And it's interesting because when most people see this demographic change that's projected there, what they imagined, interestingly enough, is that you can see what's going on, is that the growth rate is actually mostly in the Latino population, also in the API population. But seeing that growth, what most people imagined was sort of a straight line into the future, so that eventually California would be 150% Latino. People would have to say California the right way. San Diego, right, with real pizzazz. Oakland would, of course, always be Oakland. It just is, right? But if you look at the demographic change for California, it's actually tapering off, slowing down. And here's the startling demographic fact. Of the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States that did not see, in the last 10 years, places like Baltimore and Denver and New York and Newark and Atlanta, Las Vegas, what do you think is the only metro area, a large metro area in the United States, that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children? Any guess? You're right, Los Angeles. Los Angeles was the only large metro area because its population is stabilizing. Our share of foreign-born has actually been declining. It's more of a native-born population. If it's immigrant, it's been there for a much longer time. So the rates of childbirth are slowing, etc. And you can see this as well in the share of the population that's immigrant, which is been tapering off for a while in LA. It's beginning to taper off for the last 2 or 3 years in California. And we actually also have a much more settled immigrant population. This is the percent of the immigrant population that's been in the United States since 1999. You'll note that for California, 72% of its immigrant population has been in the country for that period of time. In fact, about 55% of our undocumented population has been in the country for longer than 10 years. Very settled, very much part of the fabric, sort of coming to an end of a demographic process. By the way, if you look carefully at this chart, you'll notice that the state that has the second most settled immigrant population is Vermont. And that's because they have like 2 immigrants, and they've been there a very long time. And I know, and if you're from Vermont and you felt sort of slighted by that, sorry. So you can see this change by looking at maps of the change as well, and then we'll complicate the dimensions a little bit more. So the first thing to realize here is that if you look at this map from 1980, that the sort of population that was majority people of color, hardly any in California. The only county was Imperial County. But in 1980, the United States looked like what most people still think it looks like. The Black Belt of the South going up to D.C., the Hispanic borderlands of Texas with Mexico, the Hispanic and Native American areas of New Mexico and Arizona. In 1990, this is what the country looks like. Note the change starting to occur in California. In 2000, but now the change is starting to occur elsewhere in 2010. And this is what the country looks like going forward. 2020, 2030, 2040. So the key message is that diversity is coming to a theater near you. Hollywood may not know it yet, but they will. That is that this change is not something that's happening just in certain locations. It's happening all over the country, and it's something the country needs to be grappling with. One part of the change, and I was going to skip this graph that most people don't pay attention to, is the fact that where the diversity is increasing most rapidly, and also where poverty is increasing most rapidly, is in America's suburbs. So this is the city of Seattle, a little bit unusual in some ways, but you can see that in 1980, the communities of color were basically concentrated in the city of Seattle. This is what Seattle looks like in 2010. You're going to notice two things. The city of Seattle widened, and the southern suburbs became increasingly people of color. A lot of folks being pushed out of the city because of high housing prices, and also a huge influx of immigrants into the Seattle area, and in particular into the South County. One of the reasons why this is important is because America's suburbs are places that lack civic infrastructure, they lack social services infrastructure, and they often lack social movement infrastructure, which is how low-income communities get their issues raised to the level of civic attention. So this is actually so this change is happening all over the country. It's happening in places that are not very much prepared for it, and where there's not good services infrastructure and organizing infrastructure. And there's another aspect of this demographic change which is really critical, and it has to do with the age structure of the population. So, to me, the most interesting aspect of what's going on is the following graph, the median age. So, what this shows you is that for the United States as a whole, the median age for non-Hispanic whites is 42. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders, 35. The median age for African Americans and for Native Americans is about 32. And the median age for Latinos, 27. And this graph then tells you two things. One is it tells you about what's driving your demographic change, because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may well be. Godspeed. But the second thing it tells us is 42, 27, that's 15 years. That's a generation gap. And that generation gap explains an older generation looking at a younger generation and not making the investments that are needed. Now, let me just give you a couple of anecdotes to drive this home, and then some real facts. So the state that has the largest generation gap, the whitest old, the brownest young, Arizona. Think about the fractious politics in Arizona around immigration, ethnic studies in the schools, etc. And then think about the fact that in the last 5 years, the third largest state level cuts in per capita K through 12 education, Arizona. The largest cuts, percentage-wise, in spending on public education at the university level, Arizona. The third largest increases in tuition for the public universities, Arizona. And we did a study looking at counties in the United States in which we asked the question, if the generation gap is larger, does the county spending on education per student go down? When you run a multivariate regression in which it's a time series cross-section fixed effects regression, in which we control for the other variables that explain education spending, like resource levels, demand, etc. And we find that when the generation gap is larger, education spending is lower. By the way, if you understood all that fixed effects regression stuff, welcome to graduate school. If you didn't, all it means is that I'm right. So we've got a disconnected set of generations, and it's reflected in our national politics. It's reflected often in our local politics, and all of this is intersecting with a tremendous crisis of inequality in the United States. So many of you know that this issue has been coming to the fore. How many of you have heard of this book? How many of you read this book? Okay. I'll let you know that according to Amazon.com, which can track how far you got in your Kindle, this is the most unread book in America. So it sold very well, but it has not been read because people start to read it and they go, oh my God, it's translated from the original French and it was written by an economist. Oh no. But what it's done has been part of a zeitgeist or sort of spirit of the time of raising issues of inequality. And it's no wonder, because if you look at the distribution of income in the United States, the blue line being the share of income going to the top 1%, you can see that there's two peaks here, 1928, right before the Great Depression, 2007, right before the Great Recession, and that despite that going down a little bit during the first years of the recession, it's back on its way up, income going to the top 1%. So we have a very sharp challenge of inequality in the United States. And when people see that, there's two things that often get raised. First is, well, gosh, we've got a lot of inequality, but at least we have a lot of mobility, right? So it's a lot of inequality, but people are kind of hopping around the income distribution. Now, it turns out that that's not true. This is a chart looking at the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality, and something called the intergenerational earnings elasticity, which is a very complicated way of saying class stickiness. That is, what's the likelihood if you start in the lowest quintile that you'll end in the lowest quintile, or if you start in the highest quintile of the income distribution, you'll end up in the highest quintile of the income distribution. There's two things to note here. One is that inequality is very highly correlated with class stickiness. The second is that there's only two countries that are less mobile class-wise than the United States. One is the United Kingdom, and they have a queen. And the second is Italy, and they have Silvio Berlusconi, which is kind of like having a queen, right? So, guy owns the press, you know, used to run the country. So people who argue that we're mobile don't really have a lot of data on their side. The second thing is that others will say, well, we're a lot of inequality, but we're dealing with racial inequality. Turns out that's not the case either. This shows you the black to white income ratio, and the line gets spliced in 1973. You'll note that the dashed line is the Latinos. It's not that Latinos first arrived in 1973. I know, because I was born before then. But it's the first time the census starts collecting data on Latinos. So you can see that the Latinos have made a steady decline to approximate African American income, and that the black to white income ratio only goes up twice in U.S. history, in recent post-war U.S. history, during the civil rights movement and the tight economy of the 1960s, and during the Clinton years. But we've seen worsening income ratios since. So this is a problem, and it's a problem not just on sort of moral grounds, it's a problem on grounds of sustainability as well. So I've got about 5 minutes left? Okay. So one thing that's interesting is that there's been a big shift where there's more attention now looking at the relationship between equity and economic growth. And while the traditional model had been that inequality was somehow good for economic growth. The new thinking is that inequality constitutes a drag on economic growth. Constitutes a drag because it creates a lot of political conflict, constitutes a drag because, like in Arizona, it shrinks investments in human capital development, constitutes a drag because it's a drag on demand as well. And what's interesting is that this research is now emerging for such radical headquarters as the International Monetary Fund, which did a study 2 years ago looking at this internationally and finding out that the biggest drag on sustained economic growth was income inequality. There was also a study done by that well-known left-leaning organization, the Cleveland Federal Reserve, that tried to take a look at metropolitan regions the size of Cleveland and found out that those metro regions that were more unequal, more racially segregated, more split between their city and suburb, actually had slower economic growth. So we've been finding this as well in our own research, developing these ideas with PolicyLink and with the book that Dean DePass mentioned, Just Growth, which, by the way, is also available on Amazon.com, and which you could make into the second most unread book by simply buying it and moving your Kindle locator ahead, maybe a page or two. I can summarize the ideas for you now. Equity is a good thing. So why is this so important now? And then let me just come to a conclusion, and we'll talk more about policy ideas as we move along. This is what's officially or usually known as an age pyramid. And an age pyramid tries to arrange the population based on age brackets. And you can see, starting with 1950, which is just about to show up, that we used to in the United States have an age pyramid. Lots of folks who were young, thinning out through the middle, and becoming especially thin at the end as we get older and people pass away. The dark bars there are the baby boomer generation, which are sort of passing like a ball through a snake right through this chain. But you can see that we're moving from an age cylinder to 2060, an age pyramid to an age cylinder. That is, much fewer young people, much less immigration feeding the middle, many more people surviving and being old. And in fact, it's predicted that now the dependency ratio, that is essentially the number of older people that every working age adult is going to need to support, is going to rise by about 60% over the next 30 years. So when people worry about whether or not their kids are going to have the same lifestyle that they had, and they're worried about whether or not their kids will be as productive as they once were, young people today need actually, if we want to retire successfully, to be 60% more productive than we are now. So when you think about the way in which the demography is changing, the way in which inequality is growing, and the way that if you churn that forward, you're going to have a real disaster for the United States of America, it's absolutely critical to figure out a new way to move forward. I want to suggest to you that doing that's going to require developing relationships between generations and geographies. It's going to require developing new forms of data that can spur dialogue, but also fundamentally it's going to require social movements. On the roots and relationships, I've been quite taken by, for example, the example of San Antonio, Texas. In 2012, San Antonio voters passed a tax on themselves to support pre-K for disadvantaged kids. And that's pretty striking that voters would support something for disadvantaged kids. But what was more striking was the fact that that tax was passed not only with the support of community-based organizations and the mayor, but also of the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce, which lobbied for it as an investment in the workforce they were going to need 20 years from now. And the roots and relationships that have been built to make that possible, to bring the business community on board with the idea that dealing with inequality is actually key to economic prosperity in the future, absolutely critical. The second thing I think that we need is data and dialogue. You'll note that this talk is a little bit data heavy. I think those of us who raise issues that are progressive and that raise issues of fairness need to make sure that we are bringing data to the fore. That is, we need to be rooted even more than the opposition, which is sometimes completely untethered from reality, actually. We need to be much more rooted in facts, in data, in projections. And so if you're a graduate student and really interested in social justice, let me urge you to learn GIS, to learn data, to learn statistical analysis, and to be able to marshal it to make the kinds of arguments that we're making here. For example, in this project that we've done with PolicyLink, we've calculated the equity dividend that would come from closing the racial income gap in the United States. How much more GDP would we have? And then we've created a national equity atlas where people can go, it's called nationalequityatlas.org, and collect data on their metropolitan region. And every few months we update the data, and people can use it to make their own arguments for social justice. But fundamentally, and this is what I'll conclude on, if we really want to make change, we're going to need to think about and marshal the work of grassroots social movements. You know, one of the big lessons I take from the election of Barack Obama in 2008 is that there was I go around the country, some of you do too, and people go, man, we elected a black president and things didn't change. And, that's really not a great question, right? I'll answer it, because if you had thought that simply electing one person was going to change things, instead of understanding that it's an entire social movement that needs to be there to either hold the president accountable, like the immigrant rights movement did, so he had to do executive action, or to provide wind to his sails when he's trying to do something good. So when Obama got elected in 2008, everybody rushed to Washington to do policy, when they should have rushed back to the communities to do organizing to make the policy possible. And one of the real risks of being in a policy school is not understanding that intimate relationship to social movements and organizing that actually make the policy possible. Because it's projects that demonstrate what policy can do. It's policy that makes the possible standard operating procedure, but it's power that actually changes policy. Now, deploying that power is going to require doing work not simply at the national level, but also at the state and metropolitan level, because that's where we can create these policy experiments and weave people together. But it also is a big challenge. Cities are coming back just in time to be pushing out long-time residents, and one of the big issues is this issue of gentrification. Now, during the question and answer, we can talk about this. We actually just did something for California called a 12-step program to reverse inequality, in which we talked about raising the floor, growing the economy together, and creating a pathway to the middle, and arguing that you need to put all those things together. But I do want to say, by way of conclusion, that the big thing I would push on is stressing that equity and inclusion are fundamental to generating economic growth. They're not add-ons. Bridging the demographic gap in terms of understanding and in terms of income, it's not something we do just in good times or out of goodwill. It's fundamental to the future of the country. And we will only make change if we begin to bridge generations and geographies with new approaches and new organizing. And with that, let me step off and I think welcome my colleagues. I guess we're all coming up to the same time, so thank you very much.
Now, Rick has 7 minutes to...
We spent a lot of time rehearsing this.
Exactly. I'm like, who's up? It's Rick is up.
Okay. I've known Manuel for a long time, and as you can see from tonight's presentation, he's a fantastic both intellect, pragmatist, and speaker. So he's a tough act to follow. So I'm certainly not going to try and out-joke him. But there's a lot of serious stuff in there. And so let me take on a couple, raise some things I think we'll want to discuss. Really terrific analysis. But one is demography destiny. On this argument, we say, well, it will be as the white share of the population falls, as the non-white share, particularly the Latino share. If you look at those numbers, actually the African-American share, the black share is pretty stable in those numbers. So it's really the Latino share and then the API, the Asian Pacific Islander share, that's growing. And California would give you some hope that that would by itself generate politics, or at least give you the numbers that would generate a politics. But Manuel knows probably better than anyone else, or certainly as well as anyone in the room, that in California was not some natural outgrowth of the demography piece. So this is, I guess, more to the audience than to Manuel, but to think there's a big story, or a lot of stories there about how that potential of demographic change actually gets moved into social change. It's not automatic. I know he'd be the first to agree with that. That's kind of the second half of what he was talking about. But I want to caution us not to think that demography by itself gives us the destiny that we're looking for in a more progressive economy. My spouse, Teresa Ghilarducci, is an economist, a second point, so I have to, again, I want to know if we want to talk about it a little more. When I hear dependency ratios, I hear my wife, who's one of the leading retirement experts in the United States, say that that's not the case. The data on the United States were interesting, that there, at least the Arizona cases, the opposition that you got, the idea was that it's older whites who don't want to spend money on younger non-white kids, and there's certainly a lot of that in the United States. But there's a U.S. political culture, one to take from Manuel's own playbook, that if you are going to take on a powerful electoral group and tell them you're going to fight with somebody else, that's probably not our optimal way to address that problem. And second, if you look at countries that aren't the United States, we have a weaker state and weaker social solidarity generally in most countries, in Europe and other places that spend more on the elderly, spend more on young people. We're thrown into an argument that the budgets are necessarily opposed to each other, but again, that's our politics. There's not a built-in together demographic and destiny. That's a social movement issue, which again, I'm pretty sure Manuel would agree, at least in general, on that. We might disagree about the specifics or the contours of what that looks like. But I want you to keep that in mind when you hear those age issues, that it's somehow greedy, older, mostly white people are taking money away for their inadequate retirement in Medicare system, and that's the thing that's hurting kids. We have a federal budget that says that that's how they have to fight with each other, right? There's something called the military budget. There's something called tax revenue that could solve that problem. The idea that those groups are necessarily set against each other, and again, the European numbers tell us that that's not the case. These, in a way, are a little picky issues, because there's so much of what Manuel is saying that I agree with, both now and in his work, which I've admired for years, both his scholarly work and his practical work. So let's bear down on a couple of those. The first is this issue about inequality. Can we mobilize that? It is true we have these staggering levels of inequality. It's even worse, and again, I'm telling you, and this Manuel knows these numbers cold, it's not just the top 1%, it's the top 1/10 of 1%. That's actually where almost all the income and wealth gains have gone. It's like 160,000 families in the United States have really got this. So then the big mystery comes, well, if that's true and we've got this demographic shift, why are our policies so crummy? I mean, we can pick more dramatic words to describe them. Why are they so bad? And that's the politics, I think, that he's connecting, thinking about cities, that one of the things with all that wealth allows you to do is, in essence, buy the political system, what an economist would call a rent, right? That you get money and then you spend your money on buying lobbyists, buying really smart people to punch holes in regulations, and so that this democratic movement is, in a way, the essence of letting any of the economic or political forces work. The system is really quite compromised now by money in politics, and you can see where that money concentration is. Can we solve that at the federal level? I am also in very big sympathy that we should keep agitating there. It's these local and regional experiments and innovations that we have to start with and hope that they eventually, or not just hope, but work to build them up into a national movement. It's very hard to start at the national level. That's not how the opposition succeeded in doing this. They didn't suddenly start and capture the heights of the economy. They've had some national elections, but there's been a very careful building of this in states over the last 30 years. I grew up in Kansas, near Kansas City, which is kind of a theocracy these days, and I get field reports from my sister, but the last governor of, the governor of Kansas now has driven the economy into a ditch with tax cuts. He's also fanatically anti-choice and anti-immigrant. But so he's to the point where even some Republicans in Kansas didn't like what he had done on the economy. But the last governor in Kansas was a Democrat, not a progressive Democrat by New York standards, but Kathleen Sebelius. And it has been succeeded by this. They have been building very carefully an electoral movement in these states for quite some time now. That is, and we're seeing them reap the successes of that. So inequality issues won't solve itself. I'm a big admirer. I'm doing some work now, some comparative case study work on Los Angeles, New York, and Detroit, and I'm a big admirer and have learned a lot from Manuel and his colleagues about the Los Angeles experience, because Los Angeles has done a lot of progressive things. He didn't have time to talk about them much here. He talked about them more with the students that he met with beforehand. But that didn't just come out of nowhere. It was exactly this: people with actually seemingly very different interests, environmentalists, union, and communities of color in LA in principle matter, where that are often seen as fighting with each other or having oppositional ideas, have figured out ways, and not because it's Brigadoon or some kumbaya moment, because they've really put their interests on the table. None of them could get what they wanted just by insisting on it and shutting everybody else out. And they've had to learn successfully to work with each other. We don't have that yet in New York. We have moments towards it, but I don't think we've got that kind of architecture. And that, to me, is ultimately where this has to go. It's all three of those movements, which obviously overlap a lot of the same individuals at times, have got to learn to work together more effectively. Maybe income inequality will be the hinge of that. Maybe it will be environment and sustainability issues. I think that's a big piece of the story that can be brought together to bring those groups together. There are a lot of very specific things. Again, they've happened in LA. There are proposals to do them in New York and other cities where you can do environmental things that also generate jobs, particularly for low-income and marginalized communities. And I think that's an important piece to do. So I know Manuel wouldn't say that demography is destiny, but I want to make sure that we call that out. There's a story here about how those factors in demography get mobilized for social change, and that's the major task that's before us, which, again, Manuel is a tireless worker in that field. So these are meant to be more, I think, a gloss. I mean these comments more as a gloss on what we saw than any kind of critique about them.
Great. Thank you. So now we have about 20 minutes for me to grill you both. And Manuel, one of the questions I was going to ask you is, why has it not worked in Washington, D.C. with Obama? And that you said that would be a really stupid question when you were up there. So I will revise it. That really wasn't my question. I know better. I've been trained by Manuel. I know better than to ask that question. But you have been doing racial justice work for, gosh, almost 30 years, if not, give or take. And with the class earlier today, you talked about the moment in time in 1992 around the civil unrest in Los Angeles. And there's been so much conversation of late around what's happening in St. Louis, what's been happening in New York, the whole Black Lives Matter effort. And I'm curious, what learnings and opportunities are you able to grab from Los Angeles and the civil unrest in that moment in time in 1992 that really did have a long-lasting impact and got different groups together? And Are there similarities that you're seeing with regards to Ferguson? What are your thoughts on that?
Great question and great comments, Rick. So let me both answer your question and sneak in a comment on what Rick said. So I talked to the students earlier about folks in the wake of the LA civil unrest trying to figure out what to do. And some of you heard this story before, but the thing that I always remember is we were, after the LA civil unrest, going from meeting to meeting, thinking if we went to one more meeting, we'd actually solve something. And someone in the middle of one of those meetings said, there's an immediate need to think long term. And it like grabbed us that instead of trying to address the immediate crisis, we actually had to think about what it might mean to build power on a multiracial basis, what it might mean to have a different and alternative vision for the economy, and what it might mean to actually have a political strategy that involved inside-outside politics, both eventually capturing City Hall, which is what happened, but actually doing that in the context of disciplined social movements that could actually hold that mayor and this mayor accountable to the vision of those movements, rather than to simply their particular political ambitions. So I would encourage those who are the most involved in the Black Lives Matter movement to think long term, because I feel like what happened with Occupy was there was no long-term thinking, and there was resistance to an organizational, structure. One of the things that happened in LA was people said, sure, let's build big organizations, because we're going to actually need that to contend against sort of big power. So I would urge people to think about what's the long-term strategy here without dictating it. The second thing that I actually have found, and I see it in New York, I see it elsewhere, that's kind of heartening, and then I'll loop it back to the demography is destiny thing, is the number of young people who are not African American who are involved in the Black Lives Matter. And I know it can sometimes seem also like these are travelers, right, for whom this is not their issue. But on the other hand, I was in LA, opened up the paper, and my Asian American graduate student was like being arrested on the front page of the newspaper for protesting Ferguson. This is a movement that a lot of people are feeling something about, and there's something very important about this that I'm going to lift up with the demography is destiny issue. Demography is not destiny. Things can turn out in very different ways. And the biggest identity that's being struggled over these days is the Latino identity. So is the Latino identity in the United States going to be an identity in which you can assimilate into the mainstream and leave African Americans behind? Or is it an identity that's kind of being shut out because of this anti-immigrant attitude in which Latinos will begin to identify and do identify with African Americans in that experience? That is really fundamentally critical, because to the extent that Latinos identify with the African American experience, then they have a people of color identity. That means that there's bridges that can be built around systematic racism. To the extent that they have an identity that rejects that alliance, that's an identity that's assimilationist and runs the risk of leaving behind not just African Americans, but immigrants and a number of other folks. And that's why anybody who thinks that the work that I do on building black-brown unity is sort of like I'm just doing it out of goodwill or something, I think that that alliance is absolutely fundamental to the social justice struggles of our urban areas. And so it's been, for example, the Ezel Ford, which was also a shooting of an African American in South Los Angeles, at least in LA, is almost never told without talking about Omar Abrego, who also got killed at the same time. So there's a lot of work on kind of bringing those alliances together, and I think that's something really that I would urge people in the Black Lives movement to keep in mind, that what's at issue here is police community relations and treatment of the African American community, and this was without negating, and I will continually lift up, that it's African American males who are far more than Latino males, who are far more than white males, disabused by police, over-incarcerated, etc. So without negating the reality of that experience, how do we use this organizing to also shift Latino identity in a people of color direction? By the way, the Republicans are really helping out with that by kind of rejecting immigration reform. And we're going to release a report, which I just want to give you a little bit of a highlight of, which is pretty interesting. When people think about what the president did, they tend to identify the DACA part for the young people as being for young people. But about 90% of the people who are going to benefit, sorry to get that number wrong, about 70% of the people who are going to benefit from the extension of the deferred action for childhood adjustments are older than 30. Because the big thing the president did was allow older people to come in on that. The majority of young people who are going to benefit are the kids of the DAPA parents. There's 5.5 million children who were born in the United States who can either vote in the next 4 years, large share of them. We'll be providing the numbers this Thursday, who can punish people who are going to treat them in this way, take away their right, threaten their parents' security, etc. And this is something that's really fun. I mean, it's not striking that 71% of Latinos voted for Obama in the last election. What is striking is 73% of Asians voted for Obama, despite the fact that they're higher income. Why? They're being alienated by this anti-immigrant rhetoric. They're being driven to a people of color consciousness, which I welcome, and we need to sort of be thinking about how to consciously make that happen, because Rick is correct. Demography is not destiny. There's a bunch of steps along the way so that people identify with the underdog.
Okay. Rick, would be great to hear kind of what you think. We talked a little bit earlier today about opportunities in New York, and as we think about economic inclusion and opportunity and what needs to happen. So I'd be curious your take on that piece. But also, as we do think post-Obama, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the newspaper that says the natural pendulum means that it's going to swing towards something very different from President Obama for the next, as we think about the next president. So can you talk about New York and opportunity, and then what you're thinking?
Yeah, no, it's always fun to forecast, because I'm an economist and we love to make forecasts. So, Will Rogers once said an economist can tell you the future with absolute certainty, and his guess is as good as anybody's. So New York, and then the Obama. Let me do the Obama things first, because I think it's quick. Okay, I don't buy that in the presidential. I think we have a huge problem in the Congress. And my point, if you assume Hillary Clinton is the nominee, what demographic group will she do worse with than Obama did? I mean, she's not going to lose. Maybe people won't turn out, but sort of that. I mean, who else is she going to? She's going to get some more white votes than Obama. She's going to get some more white female votes, maybe even some recalcitrant white male votes. It's hard to see her underperforming any of those groups. So I think the national level, I do think that it's gone. On the other hand, the Republicans, with this long game they've been playing in the states and our federal system, the best illustration of this is Pennsylvania. Obama carries it in 2012 by 5 percentage points. The Republicans win 13 House seats, and the Democrats got 5. 2-to-1 ratio in a state that Obama won. When they control these governorships and legislatures, they have got, this thing is very heavily gerrymandered. So I think we Democrats, progressive, whether you think of them as progressive is another whole discussion. So that's when that's a press thing. I think they're filling up time till the next election. The press and the pundits were absolutely wrong in the last election. They got everything wrong, and the social scientists got it all right. So when someone shows me massive shifts away from Democrats and Hillary Clinton among key demographic groups in the electorate, then I would worry about, is Rand Paul exciting to people? And he won't get the nomination anyway. Okay, New York City. New York, I think, I like Mayor de Blasio, but I think, and this is kind of an ungrounded theory, so I'll throw it out there, that it's a little top-down. You know, it's an electoral thing where City Hall was captured, but without the kind of long work that was done in Los Angeles. Because again, Manuel was right, the LA mayors were both put in by the movement that grew up there, but also are checked by them and policed by them in a way. And now that movement has moved out to the county level with the passage of, in 2009, was it? The Los Angeles imposed a tax on itself to build transit, and transit with a very strong workforce component that goes principally to poor residents operated by mostly white-led, increasingly less white-led, but still heavily trade unions who are seen as a very, and they had to do that with a 2/3 vote on the ballot because California has this goofy rule that you can't raise taxes without 2/3. In the middle of one of the worst recession we've had since the Great Depression. That's swinging a big stick. You know, that's doing something. We don't have anything like that going in New York, in part because housing is more the issue than economic development. But if you look at, I mean, I think the mayor wants to do, he's got a lot on his plate to do, but New York is not as aggressive on or comprehensive on community benefit agreements, the things where if the city's going to give a subsidy, you get something tangible, something enforceable and tangible back for it. New York hasn't put those things in place yet. I hope they will at some point. We've got a more progressive city council. New York has a very strong mayor because we have a big 50 people on the city, 52, I ain't going to fit city council compared to what, 13 and 15 in LA. So the city council there actually swings a little more strength. And then we've got a bad region. You know, this regional stuff is great, but all of us doing the regional work have struggled by it's the political unit that you control. We have a governor in New Jersey that raised New York businesses with tax subsidies all the time. So the moving to the regional level, I'm really looking right now a lot at what cities can do on their own. They can raise their own minimum wage, and they should. There's no evidence that that hurts things. They can try and do things. New York City's got this red-hot housing market, which they can try and ride for a while and tap for other issues. But I don't see an aggressive community benefits piece, and in some ways I don't want to blame the mayor, that we don't have the movement structure yet that, at least in LA, I don't know if you could reproduce it here exactly. Again, it's this triangle I'm talking about between environmental and sustainability, communities of color, and what I think of as kind of the jobs people who tend to be unions, but also certain sectors of the business community. They haven't been brought together in any way here, and until that happens, I think it'll be harder for us to go deeper on these policies.
Great. So last question, this class is called Policy in Action, and so we spend a lot of time really thinking about how do you make change using policy as a lever, but not 10,000 feet up of passing policy that stays on the books, but true change on the ground impacting the communities that we care so much about. So would love for you guys to, before we open it up for Q&A, to think a little bit about, as we think about the next generation of practitioners, so our folks that are going to be out there, whether they're in academia or running nonprofits or in philanthropy or in the private sector, you know, what are the skills and strategies and tools that they should have in their tool belt as they get ready to lead? Because things are different. Some of it's the basics, bread and butter of the organizing is super important and relationship building and those types of things. But I'm curious, 30 years in plus, what would you impart?
So maybe I'll tell a story.
Please.
So for years, one of the first things I started working on was environmental justice issues, and we spent a lot of time demonstrating disparities in terms of environmental exposures in communities of color versus white communities in California, and by income, and also in multivariate regression analyses. And we did all of this work showing that there were these disparities, that they were actually, these hazards were placed in communities of color, not that minorities moved in afterwards, looking at the consequences for children, et cetera. And finally, we just got tired of demonstrating that things were wrong. And we decided that we wanted to develop a tool that would help prevent hazards from being cited. So we started a project and actually got funding from the Air Resources Board, in which we developed something called the Environmental Justice Screening Method. An environmental justice screening method sought to pre-identify communities that were environmentally overexposed and socially vulnerable. I can tell you the technical part of that, it's very sophisticated, lots of GIS, blah, blah, blah. We started it with a meeting in Oakland with 40 community organizers from around the state to listen to them about what they wanted in an environmental justice screening method, which totally freaked out the public agency that was paying for this, because the idea that you would actually start with community people and take their input. And we said, we've worked with these people for years. We're not going to be able to do everything they want, but we need to be able to listen to them. So we wound up, took several years, we devised an environmental justice screening method that the state then didn't really like because we were considering hazards, and by the way, the community really liked it, but the government didn't like it. So they decided to develop an alternative. And they put out their alternative, and it was like viciously attacked by community and made fun of, and it was not that good. So then they started to develop something called CalEnviroScreen, in which CalEnviroScreen has, in its first iteration, had some issues. Then they asked us to consult, and they've now moved CalEnviroScreen to be very close to the environmental justice screening method. And CalEnviroScreen is now an official tool that is a tool of the government of California that is being used to allocate cap and trade dollars to communities that are environmentally overexposed and socially disadvantaged. And this year, for the first time, it's going to reallocate 1/4 of the $1 billion coming in through cap and trade to those communities. And it's projected that in the next couple of years, those revenues are going to increase overall to $2 to $4 billion. So it'll be $1 billion a year going into low-income communities that face environmental justice issues. And not just the ones that have protested, but the ones that are actually overexposed, but they haven't organized yet. So this is really going to be advantageous for them. What made that happen? Some technical skills that you should get in graduate school. Some willingness to deal with data and do it in a complex way that is so rigorous that the state has wound up coming to us rather than us having to move our methodology to the state. Community organizing, making sure that there's an inside-outside game in which the outside organizers kept pressing for CalEnviroScreen to make the changes that were much more similar to the tool we developed. We can go into detail, but basically that's the story. Humility on the part of the researchers, not to think that they knew the answers, but to know that we needed to involve the community from the beginning to find out what was important and what would resonate. And it led us to make all sorts of methodological things, like to include hazards because communities think that's important, and to come up with a method that was easy to explain. Because if community was going to use it, they had to be able to explain it too. And at the end of the day, it's a long time, but next year I get to see $250,000, $1 billion going into these communities, and within a couple of years, $1 billion going into these communities. That's pretty satisfying.
Yeah. I can't improve on the specifics of that answer. The only thing I would add to students is when you looked at that demographic pyramid becoming a cylinder, as those older white people leave the labor force or leave this life, jobs are opening up. And the public sector actually has an older age profile than the private sector. Even in this day of governmental shrinkage and constraint, there's going to be opportunities for you to do that kind of work both in the public sector and in the nonprofit sector, and maybe even in the private sector.
Great. And as a public sector employee, I
Yes,
appreciate
that's right.
that plug. So we're going to now open it up for questions and answers and conversations. So I think there's a mic, because it's being filmed, if you want to go to the
I think mic's
corner.
on stands, it looks like.
Pam?
I haven't read Piketty's book, but I did read Kevin Phillips' Wealth and Democracy. And what he points out is that the rise of the middle class after the Second World War was an anomaly, that prior to the Second World War, there was social class rigidity or stickiness, as you call it, that goes all the way back to the colonial period here. I don't really see your optimism. You know, with the Moore's law, with the advance in technology, the people are saying that we don't need the lower 20% of the labor force right now. Where that's going to be 20 years from now will be even worse. And so I don't see where your optimism comes from.
Well, I have to get up every morning, so that's one thing. But you know, let me say that part of the optimism comes from that California's America Fast Forward experience. So, you know, I began, you know, just in the last couple of years, aside from the taxing ourselves to put in mass transit and then developing a jobs program for disadvantaged workers that's tailored to that, aside from passing driver's licenses for undocumented, aside from passing the California Trust Act so that we're no longer cooperating with ICE and handing people over, aside from the fact that we've, you know, we're moving forward on climate change, and that the leading proponent of it now is a guy named Kevin De Leon, the Speaker Pro Tem of the Senate, who cut his teeth as a community organizer during the Prop 187 battle around immigration, seeing the movements for the minimum wage and the living wage that have occurred in California, seeing that in an off-year election, this last election, we passed Prop 47, which everybody said you couldn't do. It's a proposition which has reduced from felony to misdemeanor a lot of violations that's now pulling people out of prison and back. It's kind of beginning the de-incarceration of California, and we'll be able to do more. I'm optimistic because I see a little bit of where I think America could end up, not just demographically, but with the intentionality of the organizing that needs to be in place. So I think the underlying economic forces are severe, and you probably shouldn't read Piketty because you'll be even more pessimistic than you are now, because he's extraordinarily pessimistic. But you know that period in which productivity growth and wage growth went together was a period in which we had the sort of social institutions that made that possible and the social movements that put those institutions in place. And so it's fundamentally up to us to create those social movements and then to trigger those public institutions into being.
Yeah, that's the story about robots too. It's not an issue about robots. We've always had technology displacing labor. The question is whether we have social institutions and movements capable of transmitting those gains in productivity to the large group of the population, or they just grabbed by a few people. In the past, we've had lots of introduction of technology, but we had social movements, labor unions, and others that were able to spread that out, right? And now we don't. We've lost that control. The productivity that's being generated by those things isn't being widely shared, but that's not a function per se of technology.
Pam?
Oh, okay. So I just got a couple of questions, and thank you for that presentation because it really piqued my interest in terms of numbers. But I'm just wondering how we'll be able to legislate a more equitable distribution of wealth through policies as we look, you know, down towards the next 50 years as we become more of a people of color nation, and what will a wealthy nation look like in terms of a majority, you know, people of color. I'm just really interested in, you know, since the wealth is kind of like held by the top 1/10 of 1% or whatever. Is that going to be distributed as the years go on, you know, as they talk about inheritance and things of that nature? So.
That's a great question. Let me just say a couple things. I'm sure Rick has a few things to say too. So I would urge you to take a look at, there's a website called capitalinmaine.com, and we just did a report, or there was a series of articles starting with something called the California Chasm on inequality in California, and then ending up with sort of a 12-step program for California, which I highlighted at the end, or just briefly mentioned at the end. I mean, one fundamental thing about this is reclaiming our democracy, because as long as you have wealth controlling politics, it's very difficult to implement any other kind of policy. I do think that what we need to do there's stuff we need to do to lift the floor. Some of that has to do with increasing the minimum wage, stopping wage theft, etc. Another part is encouraging and facilitating reentry for the formerly incarcerated population, and then immigration reform, which will lift up the bottom as well. We also need to be able to find sweet spots of things that sort of grow the economy. I think it's really important for equity proponents not to be locked into a redistributive mechanism, but looking for those redistributive moves that actually lead to economic growth. So when you're taking somebody out of the prison system and making them a productive part of the labor force, that's generating economic growth over the long haul. When you're pulling somebody out of the shadows of a broken immigration system and allowing them to claim a higher wage and allocate to a better job, that's leading to economic growth over the long haul. If you're creating free community college, which is basically the training ground for the next generation, you're generating economic growth. So one discipline the left needs to have is to move away from pure redistribution to thinking about those, what we call just growth sweet spots, places where you're getting equity and growth at the same time.
I'm going to jump in, Rick, before you go.
Fine, that's what,
No.
what I was going to say,
You're
so I'm not
next.
going to say it.
I mean, what I would just add to that is I think that there's a lot of thoughts around how do you think about raising the floor from a policy standpoint directly. And I think that the experience in San Francisco has really shown that the ability for us to, when you identify what those sweet spots are, and so for example, you know, within the utility sector, and so the kind of water, sewer entities that are all over the country, the amount of opportunity, because all of us collectively are spending billions and billions of dollars. Just in San Francisco alone, we're getting ready to spend $2 billion to rebuild our sewer system. And all, you know, 1.8 billion of that will happen in an environmental justice community. And so what the approach that we've taken is to really look at that as an opportunity to develop an economic inclusion and opportunity framework, which really says, what are we going to build over with that $1.8 billion? How do you target small businesses to be able to compete and participate in that program? And what are the workers that we're going to need? And how do you really target those workers to make sure? So we always talk, like our kids could work on this project because it's going to be a 15-year infrastructure investment. So there's that component. And then I think Rick's point about public sector and opportunity as far as employment, that's the other piece. It's just like it is, and it's not just in utilities, it's across public sector everywhere, is that it's an aging, tends to be white workforce that's retiring, and that these are still great jobs. And so how you look at, and they don't all need engineering degrees, they don't all need college degrees, a lot of them are just high school and on-the-job training. And so getting the mindset of folks to start thinking about those as opportunities to lift the floor, because those have pensions, et cetera, and kind of quality around those.
I'm going to say two quick ones, Manuel. I'm just going to say amen. It's not, in fact, the left gets too hung up on redistribution. We should do that for a whole bunch of reasons, but that's not by itself won't solve the issues we've got. So Juliet mentioned one sector, infrastructure broadly. That includes environmental stuff. I don't know how we're going to pay for it, but at some point we're going to figure out we're going to have to. We have collapsing regular infrastructure in the United States, and we've got to do a bunch more because we've screwed up the environment so badly we're going to have to mitigate some stuff. So there's going to be, we have to figure out a smart way to pay for that stuff or just get the politics to do it, but that is going to happen. The other is that aging demographic pyramid. You know, we're not quite yet so heartless, I think, that we're going to throw old people out in the street, and so there need to be, there's going to be employment opportunities in that one around healthcare occupations and for taking care of our aged people. And those are two massive sectors. Again, we're stuck now in this battle about how we're going to pay for it. That's the politics of it, but those needs are going to get filled at some point.
You know, and the bottom line message from all of this is that the left has traditionally sort of surrendered to the right the economic argument. Look how well they've managed, right? I mean, they end every Republican administration with financial crisis. Democrats help kind of rescue the thing. And then, so we really have to own the economic argument. Maybe we can take two more real quick.
Yeah, I think how are we on time? I thought we were okay on time.
Well, why don't we just get the question?
Yeah, so why don't we just go that side and then we'll go.
Well, basically, one of my main concerns, which has been for a while, is with technical issues. So, for instance, there's very few people seem to have technical know-how for many things, and the knowledge is concentrated in the hands of a few. In a case so primarily, it's quite easy for multiple violations to happen on multiple levels. How would exactly that make it different from what maybe perhaps could be developing right now?
You want me to take a couple and then
Yeah, sure, we can take them all.
couple?
So, Professor Pastor, I looked at the demographic slides that you showed, and as someone who plans to be old in 2040, it made me freak out, because I keep thinking that the younger generation is really the generation that we're gonna, or the generations that we're gonna depend on when we're all old and taking Social Security and all those things. And so there's clearly a self-interest in it for us to educate and prepare the younger generations for the future. But clearly, as we saw from California and Arizona, this is not happening. The opposite is happening. And so, you know, you can fight this battle with data and statistical analysis and GIS, and that's great. But how can we break through with communications? What arguments work? Mm-hmm. What is compelling?
Oh wait, you're taking many questions.
I was very fascinated by what you say in California. You raised, like, you know, $250 million to bring to the lower income. In New York, we get the opposite, actually. I was assisting a town hall meeting in December 16 in New York, where there was a report that says that the money that was allocated to the low incomes, like housing, was giving to the police like $37 million a year. Bloomberg was taking from NYCHA to repair their building and maintenance and build housing, public housing, more public housing, was giving to the police, actually, to patrol the walls of those buildings and the stairs. And what strategy that you use? There's a property tax, actually, was allocated to NYCHA that was giving to MoMA during Bloomberg. So what strategy that you used to raise all of that money to the low income? This is the opposite we have in New York. So I'm just curious about how you made it happen.
This question is from the live stream audience. It's actually from Ann Price. She's the director of Racial Wealth Gap Initiative at the Insight Center for Community and Economic Development. Hi, Ann. Yeah, she's coming to our class in a couple of weeks, actually. Her question was, and you touched on it when you spoke on the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's whether, or who, so who becomes white in the nation becomes fluid. She asks whether Latinos today will become the new whites of the future, and I guess my piggyback to the question is, or will they be integrated as part of the existing white community?
One last question.
Yeah.
This is a practical question. We talk about the regional economic equity case that you made in the beginning, but I'm assuming there's going to be some opposition to this, right? Sure. So do you anticipate the opposition? What type of opposition do you anticipate will be coming, either from the right or gerrymandering or weapons of the sort? And how do we counter that opposition?
Yeah, these are really rich questions. I guess I'll maybe let you, Rick, do the opposition. I'm just trying to allocate this so we don't.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Because I wanted to, I'll pick up on two of these, the compelling argument one and then the Latino and racial identification. Mm-hmm. The fascinating thing is the way the census has asked this question. They started in 1970 with a pilot, and in 1980 they started asking people first, what race are you? Then they asked you whether you're Hispanic or not Hispanic. And in 1980, it's about 40% of Latinos marked other. And so the census was confused, right? They said they should have marked white, black, Asian, or why'd they mark other? And they thought, well, it's 1980, it's the first time we did it, we'll do it again in 1990, and you know, maybe this time the Latinos will get it, right? So in 1990, they run the same questions. What race are you? And then are you Hispanic, non-Hispanic? And that year, more Latinos, about 47%, marked other. And so the census, in their wisdom, decided to take a look at the individual answers. And what they found out was that people would write down things like, when they were asked what race they were, they would write check other, and they would write like, Chicano. Because three exclamation marks, right? So they said, well, maybe the Latinos just need to get out of their system. So in 2000, they flipped the questions, right? So they flipped the question to being, first, are you Hispanic or not Hispanic, and then what race are you? And in 2000, more Latinos than ever marked other. Now, I don't know, I would have thought maybe Latinos are rejecting U.S. racial categories, but not the census. So in 2010, some of you may have noticed this, when they ask the race question, they say in bold beneath it, Hispanic is not a race. And then beneath that, when they ask you Hispanic or not Hispanic, they also say in bold, Hispanic is not a race. Finally, the number of Latinos marking other went down just a few percentage points, because there is this struggle around identity. But here's what's interesting. We did a study and called Where in the World is Juan and What Color is He? Trying to take a look at whether or not moving to a suburb made Latinos think they were white. And we controlled for income and everything else that should predict whether or not people might identify as being white. And what we found out is that suburban location makes a difference. But we also found out something quite interesting. Most of the literature predicts that the people who are marking other are recent immigrants. They're not used to U.S. racial categories, but as they spend more time in country, they will get more used to them, and they'll be willing to mark white or black, less as other. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So we did a multivariate regression, and we looked at that. And it turns out that the more time you spend in the United States, the less white you think you are. There's just something about the U.S. that beats the whiteness right out of you, right? So I find that the question is important, but I think that the way in which Latinos are being othered in the current political economy drives them to a sort of non-assimilationist idea, and then it depends on whether or not people engage in this. So that's my response to that. On the compelling argument, I think one thing is very important to keep in mind. And it is basically that values are thicker than interests. So if you look at the generations in the United States, you've got a generation older than the age of 65, very concerned about protecting Social Security and Medicare. You've got a generation between 45 and 65, kind of tail end of the baby boomers, doesn't want taxes raised on them, even though they're the highest earning group in the United States. You've got a group between 45 and 25 that have hit the labor market at the most difficult time. And you've got a group below the age of 25 that's coming out of an educational system in which they got shortchanged. That's a recipe for complete generational conflict if people, and they could pursue their interests, and it would argue for investments in protecting Social Security and Medicare, making the labor market work better, taxing the baby boomers more, and rescuing our education system. But you can meet your interests for a better education system for your child by putting them in private schools. But you can't meet your value that a public education system is fundamental to American democracy. It's where people learn to be citizens without investing in public education. You can meet your interests by cutting Social Security, but you can't meet your value of a decent society by cutting Social Security. You can meet your interest of protecting Social Security by shortchanging education, but you can't meet your value that all Americans are deserving of a future. So the first thing, Don, to that question is we've got to argue on values, not on interests. And the compelling story has to be about generational connection. It has to be about our future together. It's a story we're all working on, and I can talk more about it, but it has to be a values-driven story. and not an interest-based story, because you can meet your interest in multiple ways. You can't meet your values in multiple ways.
Great. Great stuff. A quick note on the assimilation question, if you don't know it, there's a wonderful book called How the Irish Became White, which is a historical tracing of a group that was seen as excluded and not but assimilated and wanted to and got there. So these are somewhat mutable categories, not easily in the United States, especially for African Americans. I don't mean to simplify that story, but I think Manuel's got it exactly right. Or is that large Latino group going to come down? Are they going to come down the side of social change, or can there be assimilation? In a perverse way, the inequality thing helps you a little bit in that situation, because there's not much income or economic gain to be gotten right now by assimilating. There probably will be. You'll get a little bit of it, but whether you could unite that and say, look, there's more economics in this for everybody. I'm not quite ready to let my economic interests go. Real quick on technology. Technology is like robots. It's neutral, right? You could have really dominating technology that's bad and restricted by people. In Detroit, they had to figure out how many blighted houses there were, and they paid community members to use a cell phone app to go out and take pictures of every blighted house in the city, and now they have a census of it. And that also, hopefully, they didn't, I think, but you could have tried to mobilize that also as a way to get people to think, hey, what do we do about all this stuff? You know, so a lot of this technology is potentially very democratizing, but the people that own it don't want it to be, but that's a little harder to control. The opposition to political stuff, you know, social movements are tough, right? I mean, there's a lot of political opposition to this stuff, and it's going to build up. And big social movements that make change, you know, it's a very broad brush now, but I mean, if you saw the movie Selma, you saw that there wasn't some perfectly united African-American led movement. There were a bunch of people with a lot of different ideas, right? Just in that movie, there was Malcolm X, and there was SNCC, and there was the SCLC, and everyone else. You don't. It takes in lots of people that do things lots of different ways. So that these regional things are really hard in the United States because we have all these little governments all over the place. The city of Pittsburgh, in its single metropolitan economic unit, has got like 750 separate governments. You know, if you count school boards and water districts and everything else, we're extremely fractionated, and that's not accidental, right? And there's a racial component to that story as to why you've got all these little suburbs all over the place. Manuel is right. Poverty is now spilling out to these inner ring suburbs, these little cities that can't handle the fiscal or the other issues in that way, but our states are peculiar things too, and so part of the trouble is that cities are very constrained by their state governments, and I think California seems to be trying to, okay, let's take over the state government and use it, well, on behalf of urban dwellers. Again, something else we don't have going in New York, but I think that's probably, there's this intermediate step of trying to get much more control of your state government, which often are set up. There was a great Times story recently about how states are keeping their cities from doing anything progressive. Right, they won't let them change their minimum wage laws. They won't even let this little town in Texas run by a Tea Party mayor. They won't let him ban plastic bags at the grocery store because and states have always actually restricted what cities do. The real change agents in American politics are located much more in cities and urban areas than they are broadly spread in states. I suspect if you even look at the California thing, it's the two powerful, it's the powerful urban centers that drive that for the state as well. But yeah, it's really hard, and I don't know how. It's very hard to overcome this stuff. So I can see where people get pessimistic looking at it. As Manuel said, you got to get up in the morning. But there are some really great individual progressive things going on now in cities, even in. And sometimes you can find things that matter to people, whether it's messaging or balloting. And two of the reddest states in the country, three of them actually, they raised the minimum wage on their ballots this year in this election, in this electoral sweep. They elected people that were opposed to raising the minimum wage, and then the voters went out and raised the minimum wage. So there are places you can find stuff to do it, but no one ever said it was going to be easy.
And I guess I would just close, and I would grab that question as well around the opposition piece, because to me, the opportunity really is around how are you at the right place at the right time, and that it's all about these mistakes. And so I just know, having done environmental justice work, ran a nonprofit that was doing regional equity and social justice work for 10 years. I mean, it was throw the spaghetti on the wall often, and it wasn't like it was not with rigor, and so it was rigorous spaghetti. But that it's a marathon and a lot of this work. And so it's like we would be asked to join lawsuits suing cities. And it's like, yeah, we'll join that lawsuit, never thinking that we'd ever win until we won, and that we sued the town of Pleasanton for their housing cap, and won, and couldn't believe it. And that, you know, we also had filed a complaint in Washington, D.C., and had been working on transportation justice issues forever. And then with the reinvestment money that was coming from the feds, ended up suing the BART, which is our subway in the Bay Area, saying that they hadn't done an equity analysis for money that they were going to receive. And surprisingly, the stars had aligned, and we actually won on that one, and they had to give the money back, and the money was redistributed for public transit, specifically for bus, which was kind of the transit-dependent people that we were fighting for. And so again, but it's like we'd been suing our regional transportation authority several times and never won. And so that, again, to me, it's how you don't lose hope is by continuing to try, because every so often you win, and being at the right place, because when the window opens, you have to be able to go through. And I think that that would be the last thing I would leave folks with. Yeah. But want to thank the panelists for being here tonight. And then do a very quick plug for next week. So next Monday we have John Powell, who is coming, as well as Noliwe Rooks, and that they'll be talking about a variety of things, including kind of what's happening with education and the role of policy, et cetera. And so we welcome you all for next week as well. Thank you.